the House. The House will be sitting this evening from 8 o'clock and probably till at least midnight, if not into the early hours of the morning, trying to conclude this legislative workload. Let us pray. As Canadians and as Albertans, we give thanks for the precious gifts of freedom and peace which we enjoy. As members of this Legislative Assembly, we rededicate ourselves to the valued traditions of parliamentary democracy as a means of serving our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you and to the Assembly a number of citizens of Alberta who have been instrumental in what I call a history-setting event. Back in March of '87, at the First Ministers' Conference on Aboriginal Rights, Premier Getty stated that the government of Alberta takes responsibility for the Métis people of Alberta. The government was committed to pursuing a new and unique institution or initiatives for self-government arrangements for Métis people, and that once they were formulated, they'd be enshrined in legislation. And I'd like to introduce a number of guests who've been instrumental in bringing forward the bills that I will be introducing today that are flexible and innovative approaches to achieving their goal of acquiring a land base as a Made in Alberta approach. The executive of the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlements Association consists of Mr. Randy Hardy as president, Mr. Ernest Howes as vice president, Mr. Richard Poitras as secretary, and Mr. Walter Anderson as treasurer. Everyone knows that there are 8 Métis settlements in the province of Alberta, and the chairman of each of the settlement councils are Archie Collins of the Elizabeth Settlement, Mr. Wayne Anderson of Fishing Lake, Floyd Thompson of Kikino, Horace Patnode of Buffalo Lake, Alphonse Laurendale of East Prairie, Ronnie Anderson of Gift Lake, Sidney Cunningham of Big Prairie, and Greg Callio of the Paddle Prairie Settlement. Together with these ladies and gentlemen is a special guest, an elder of the Federation, one of the instrumental people, along with Mr. Richard Poitras, of founding the Federation and working to protect their land base. That's Mr. Maurice Laurendale. I'd ask each of these to stand and receive the recognition and appreciation of the Assembly. Please.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions.
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to give notice of the following motion. Be it resolved that when the Assembly adjourns to recess the third session of the 21st Legislature, it shall stand adjourned until a time and a date prior to the commencement of the fourth session of the Legislature, as is determined by Mr. Speaker after consultation with the Lieutenant Governor and Council.
Introduction of bills.
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, it's indeed my pleasure today to introduce two bills. Bill number 64, Métis Settlements Act. This is enabling legislation providing for a phased approach to the devolution of provincial authority to the settlement governing entities. The General Council and Settlement Councils for each of the 8 Métis settlements will be established under this bill.
The Honourable Solicitor General has moved first reading of Bill 64, Métis Settlements Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number 64, Métis Settlements Act, introduced by the Honourable Mr. Rostad, is now read a first time.
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, I also have the pleasure of introducing Bill 65, Métis Settlements Lands Act. This authorizes the issuance of letters patent to the Métis Settlements General Council, granting ownership in fee simple of those lands.
The Honourable Solicitor General has further moved first reading of Bill 65, Métis Settlements Land Act. Those in favour of first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill number 65, Métis Settlements Land Act, introduced by the Honourable Mr. Rostad, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Solicitor General.
It's also my pleasure to table with the Assembly resolution concerning an amendment to the Alberta Act.
Sure. Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table the year-end financial statements for Alberta Hospital Edmonton for the year ending March 31st, 1988.
Member for Edmonton Goldbar, followed by the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table an amendment to Bill 55, the Child Welfare Amendment Act from the Liberal Caucus. I also beg leave to table a series of amendments to Bill 29, the Mental Health Act.
Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services, I wish to table the response to question 199.
Member for Calgary North Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to table a Syncrude Canada report entitled A Decade of Progress to commemorate the 10th anniversary of production by Syncrude. It's also an opportunity to recognize and acknowledge the tremendous accomplishments of Syncrude in the area of research, technology, record production, and cost reduction. As well, it's important to recognize the commitment of the owners, management, and employees to the future of oil sands in this province. Mr. Speaker, copies of the report have been distributed to all members.
Okay.
Special guests. Ministerial statements.
Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, you will recall that on June 3rd, 1985, this Legislative Assembly passed a resolution concerning an amendment to the Alberta Act, commonly referred to as Resolution 18. This resolution committed the province of Alberta to transferring in fee simple, with certain exemptions, the Métis settlements land to appropriate Métis corporate entities and to the protection of these lands in the Constitution through amendment of the Alberta Act. On June 17, 1987, I tabled before this Assembly, for discussion purposes, a document called Implementation of Resolution 18. During the last year, this document was the subject of a continuing dialogue between the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlement Associations and the Alberta Government. This dialogue was immeasurably enhanced by input received from settlement members and other interested parties. As a result of this dialogue, and in the spirit of cooperation, some major revisions have been made to the proposals contained in implementation of Resolution 18. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to introduce to the Assembly two bills to further implement Resolution 18. These are the Métis Settlements Land Act and the Métis Settlements Act. As well, I was pleased to table a proposed resolution to amend the Alberta Act. The introduction of these bills and the proposed amendment to the Alberta Act is not the end of the process to implement Resolution 18. It represents another step in a journey that the province and the Métis set out on 50 years ago. Like its 1938 predecessor, the Métis Settlements Act is enabling legislation establishing certain basic elements of the structures and systems of government on Métis settlements. The Métis Settlements Land Act provides for the transfer of approximately 1.28 million acres of land to Alberta's Métis. This government is committed to the principles and concepts in the Métis Settlements Act and the Métis Settlements Land Act. We are also committed to the establishment of a process for the full implementation of Resolution 18. This process will be based upon the principle of close consultation and the spirit of cooperation, which has been the foundation of the mutual commitment of the Métis and the government to Resolution 18. The views of Albertans, Métis and non-Métis, will be sought, and wherever possible, these will provide the basis for further implementation of Resolution 18 and the enabling legislation before you today. Mr. Speaker, it has always been a matter of agreement between the province and the Métis settlements that Section 43 of the Constitution be the legal instrument used in seeking the constitutional protection of the Métis settlement lands for Alberta's Métis people. In order to seek federal support for the application of Section 43 of the Constitution to meet our mutual purposes in the implementation of Resolution 18, we have carefully selected the wording of the resolution to amend the Alberta Act, and over the next few months we'll be discussing this wording with the federal government so as to ensure the use of Section 43. For the information of those who may not be familiar with Section 43, it is the section of the Constitution Act that allows for constitutional amendment to occur between the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, the Senate, and the House of Commons on matters of applicability to Alberta only. Such a constitutional amendment would not require the approval of other provincial legislative assemblies. This government is of a strong view that matters such as these should be agreed upon only by those parties directly affected. Mr. Speaker, in the past year, consultation and cooperation have also led to the establishment of a process that will hopefully lead to a negotiated settlement of the lawsuits between the Métis settlements and the Government of Alberta. It is my desire that the eventual proclamation of these bills will occur in an atmosphere no longer clouded by the existence of a legal dispute between the settlements and the province, whether this is accomplished through the courts or through negotiations. The bills must be understood as part of a long process of negotiations that began in earnest when Resolution 18 in 1985. That statement of government intent was unanimously endorsed by this Assembly and led to the extensive discussions with the Métis. We then tabled a more comprehensive paper, implementation of Resolution 18, outlining a possible framework for protecting the land and providing for local self-government. We now are introducing actual bills. They will be debated in this Assembly. They will also be debated outside of this Assembly. Our commitment to consultation continues. In particular, we want legislation that the Métis can live with, because that is what they will have to do. Given that, we are not going to complete the legislative process until we are sure that what becomes law will benefit the Métis settlements, in their view, as well as ours. Mr. Speaker, 50 years ago, the first Métis settlements were set aside, and the Métis Population Betterment Act was proclaimed. This legislation has stood virtually unchanged, although the settlements and the province have changed dramatically. The current Métis Betterment Act no longer adequately addresses the needs and aspirations of the Métis people, nor reflects the attitude of Albertans. It is this disparity which the government seeks to redress today. This would not have been possible without the commitment and efforts of many Albertans. Perhaps the most significant contributions have been made by the members of the settlements themselves. Their commitment to their past and their vision of the future have been the foundation of the efforts of all those involved. In particular, the executive and board members of the Alberta Federation of Métis Settlements Associations deserve special mention. I am proud, Mr. Speaker, that this government has been able to respond to the wishes and aspirations of the Métis in Alberta with the introduction of the two bills and the tabling of the resolution to amend the Alberta Act before you today. The joint efforts of the Métis people and the Alberta government have resulted in this truly made in Alberta process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the government is well aware, back on June 3rd, 1985, when the Legislative Assembly passed this resolution, referred to as Resolution 18, Mr. Speaker, they had the support of myself at that particular time and the official opposition, Mr. Speaker. And if I may say so, I'm glad that consultation has occurred and continues to occur. And, Mr. Speaker, looking at what the minister says in this ministerial statement, that this consultation with all affected will continue, Mr. Speaker. And I am also appreciative of the fact that these major bills are going to be allowed to sit for the time being. So not only we will have more time to look at them, but also all the people that are affected. Mr. Speaker, I think it goes without saying that when we go through consultation process that the minister seems to be going through, especially with the people that are affected, I believe that we often end up with much better legislation for all affected. Perhaps we can't please everybody, but I think we go in some direction. Mr. Speaker, the only other item that I'd like to bring to the minister's attention, I noticed that he says that they want to move ahead and get the court case settled one way or the other. I would hope, Mr. Speaker, as part of that consultation, that it wouldn't have to be done through the courts, that the government would recognize that there were legitimate desires on the part of the Métis people, and it's been going on far too long, and that would be part of the consultation process. The only other point I would make is that, as I say, I think it's a job well done at this particular time. I only hope that the consultation will not take place for another 50 years, and that we'll have some resolution to this in the very near future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier ought to know that modern parliamentary democracy owes its origin to the Bill of Rights that was passed by the British Parliament in 1688. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Bill of Rights resulted from a long struggle between Parliament and the Crown. The primary issue was very straightforward. Parliament objected to the following practice by King James II, and I quote, assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending of laws and the execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, King James was just born too early. He should have been in Alberta with the Conservatives in 1988. But my question to the Premier, it's a very simple, straightforward one. Why does this government find it necessary to introduce legislation to suspend the laws and the execution of laws without prior consent of the Legislative Assembly? I'm talking, Mr. Speaker, about Bill 62.
Mr. Speaker, that legislation was introduced by the Attorney General and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. If the Honourable Leader of the Opposition wants to hold his questions till he's in the House, I'm sure he'll be happy to reply to them.
Anybody in charge over there?
Mr. Speaker, as a follow-up, is the Premier saying that he's not aware of what's in Bill 62 in the Free Trade Bill, and he can't answer the question about this major piece of legislation today?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, if you carried the Honourable Leader of the Opposition's question on, I would be answering for all the bills entered in the House. Right. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. A minister, I give responsibility for a bill, and then questions flow to that minister. And that's been true throughout the course of this session and the last two before this. I don't know why that would cause him any trouble.
Who's in charge?
Yeah, we want to know who's in charge. Is it the Attorney General then that's in charge, Mr. Speaker?
Looks that way.
Is that the question, Honourable Member?
Specifically, if I might remind the Premier what's in the bill, but why is it necessary to have an all-encompassing bill like Bill 62, which would suspend the rights of this legislature and give power to the cabinet behind closed doors to deal with the free trade agreement?
How come?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, he's asked a question of a bill introduced by my colleague. My colleague should be here for the full discussion of it. he shouldn't have to pick it up out of Hansard. That's why we have ministers responsible for bills. I don't see the big problem for the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Whoa, that's unbelievable.
Mr. Speaker.
There's no one in charge.
Mr. Speaker, to this Premier, is he saying that he has not even discussed this major piece, this bill that was brought before the House with the Attorney General, and he actually doesn't know what's in it? Is that really what he's telling us?
That's right.
Well, that bit of nonsense is certainly not what I'm telling them. What I said is that I could take responsibility for all the bills, because the bills have to go through Cabinet. I chair Cabinet, I chair priorities, and I would be obviously knowledgeable about everything that's in all the bills. But having given responsibility to certain ministers, despite the noise on the other side from the Leader of the Opposition and the member from Edmonton Highlands, who really don't want to hear an answer, I guess. Want to hear their own words.
Perhaps the Premier would like to continue?
As I said, Mr. Speaker, individual members of the House have introduced bills and are responsible for them. And I welcome the honourable members to question those members who've introduced bills. That's why we have the process of going through 3 readings and committee study. I don't know why it's such a big problem for the Leader of the Opposition, because that has been the process in Parliament and this legislature for years and years and years.
Thank you, honourable members of the Opposition. There's enough. Thank you. Westlock Sturgeon on a supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, just whereas, the third whereas in the Bill 62 says that within the jurisdiction and responsibility of the legislature can be accomplished only by the legislature of Alberta. Then, Mr. Speaker, could the Premier explain why the federal government has made it a major piece of piece of legislation and is going through the whole works, but he thinks that it can all be accomplished here?
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member wants to know what the federal government is doing, he should contact them.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question, the member from Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Economic Development and Trade, and concerns developments at the Hub Mall at the University of Alberta in my constituency. The Minister is probably aware that a considerable amount of public money is being spent to upgrade the Hub Mall there, which is a student precinct, shopping precinct, I guess you could call it. In the course of this, Mr. Speaker, a number of small merchants are being turfed out as their leases come up, even though they have rights of renewal. And my question is the Minister in a position to look into the situation to make sure that public money is not being used to the hurt of these small businessmen?
Mr. Speaker, our office is aware of the concern that has been raised by the member for Strathcona because we had received some calls. The relationship between the tenants in Hub Mall and the landlord is one that we don't believe would be appropriate for the government to inject itself into, because in the final analysis, the landlord is the University of Alberta, which is autonomous.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly sympathize with and understand the concern of the Minister in that respect. However, I have no doubt that the University is itself responding to the pressure put upon it by lack of funds from... Well, I was just coming to that, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister undertake to examine all the options to make sure, so far as he possibly can, that these unfortunate consequences to these small businessmen will be avoided?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be pleased to discuss the matter further with the honourable member. However, as I responded to his first question, that the matter is really one between the lessor and the lessee, and the government does not have an involvement other than an indirect one where the government, through the Minister of Advanced Education, provides financial support to the University of Alberta. I'd also be pleased to discuss it with my colleague, the Minister of Advanced Education, but I am reluctant to involve the provincial government directly in a relationship between a lessor and a lessee.
Well, yes, well, thank you. But will the minister do his best then or is the minister saying he can't do anything to ensure that the character of the mall as a shopping precinct for students is maintained as that?
Mr. Speaker, as I had indicated, I'd be happy to convey the honourable member's concerns to the Minister of Advanced Education, who is responsible for post-secondary institutions. But I would be reluctant to involve the government in a matter that relates to the university and their tenants.
To the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, if I may, Mr. Speaker. A small hamburger stand merchant has been in touch with me, and his $150,000 investment is being lost in the mall in favor of a franchised operation that's coming in. Will the minister undertake to have her department look into this particular franchise? I'll give her the name of the entity concerned, to make sure that the operation of this franchise is on the up and up.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be delighted to do that when the honourable member gives me the information. It may be that we have already had our department looking into that matter, but we could match names and see whether indeed it is the same circumstance. I do know that my regional office here in Edmonton has had discussions in a mediation role with both the university and one of the business owners in the Hub Mall, which resulted in a phase-in approach, which was seemingly satisfactory to both parties. So it may be that that has already been helped along, as you say.
Supplementary or main question?
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, if I may, to the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, while recognizing he doesn't want to interfere between landlord and lessee, this is a case between government and landlord. So would not the minister contact the university, which is after all financed by public monies, and tell them to haul off the dogs and use some common sense in their selection of agent and in their leasing procedures?
Mr. Speaker, as a result of calls to my office and to other MLAs and also the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs, our department and the Department of Consumer and Corporate Affairs has been indirectly having discussions. However, it would not be appropriate for the government to become directly involved between the parties.
Main question, Westlock Sturgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Premier, Mr. Speaker, as you know, in recent years, governments have come to use more and more public opinion polls. They've become more and more dependent on it, and I suspect this government is no exception. But first question, Mr. Speaker, is will the Premier consent to releasing all polls of the public using taxpayers' dollars?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would have to be much more specific than that to give some kind of a general answer. Perhaps he might want to either be more specific, contact my office directly, or put a motion on the order paper.
Mr. Speaker, all I wanted was a general answer to a general question. Well, will the Premier confirm that partisan issue questions such as party support, who is voting for who, is on these publicly paid for polls that the government is running?
Afraid, Mr. Speaker, the question or the answer stands again. The honourable member is just going to have to be more specific.
Mr. Speaker, I'm as specific as I can. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is running polls to see how people think and how they will vote. Will he at least consent to releasing all those polls that he has run, or that this government has run, in the last 6 months that ask questions of a partisan political nature? Will he release those polls? How much more specific can I be?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if they're partisan political polls, they'd be paid for by a party, not by the government.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be most surprised if the only government in the Western world that's doing it, Mr. Speaker. Then will the Premier at least consent to release from these publicly paid for polls, not the results, just the list of the questions asked, so that we can see whether they indeed are nonpartisan?
Mr. Speaker, as far as I know, there's only one individual in the House who's here, at least for question period right now, who's in a campaign these days. And if the honourable member needs help with his polling or campaigning, he's going to have to get it from his own party.
Calgary Milliken.
Mr. Speaker, in Dover community in the east side of Calgary, a disastrous fire burnt down part of the Dover Elementary School. I'm sure the Honourable Minister was aware of this unfortunate incident. I wonder if the Minister could advise if the Calgary Public School Board has the funds and money or insurance to rebuild this school.
Minister.
Yes, they do, Mr. Speaker.
If there is any problem on rebuilding the school, I wonder if the Minister could advise if she would be willing to attempt to assist the Calgary Public School Board in getting the school built for this coming year.
Mr. Speaker, I think it is in everyone's interest, particularly the students at the West Dover School, to ensure that those students and continue their educational opportunities, and every effort will be made to ensure that the program continues in the fall, although at this point I can't guarantee that that will happen. If it does not, the students will be accommodated elsewhere until they can be returned to their school.
For Athabasca Lanclavish, followed by Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We, the official opposition, have been warning the provincial government and federal government about the perils of deregulating the transportation industry. Now, some of the warnings are coming home to roost. Beside a sharp rise in safety-related problems in urban centres, we now learn that Alberta has since January the 1st blindly rushed ahead in approving licensing permits to outside province trucking firms. However, other provinces such as Saskatchewan and Ontario have not reciprocated, and now many trucking firms in Alberta are facing unfair competition and financial hardship. To the Minister of Transportation, why has the Minister moved so quickly in implementing deregulation of trucking licensing when some other provinces have not reciprocated in kind?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it may take a moment for me to answer, so I ask your indulgence. Back in 1985, a memorandum of understanding was signed by all of the provinces in Canada, with Canada, in which they would put in place the Motor Vehicle Transport Act and then get into deregulation. 1985, and we're now in July of 1988, and I don't think that can be considered to be fast, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member. What we have done in the process is identify, working with the industry, that's the Alberta trucking industry, those areas where in fact we could get some consistency, in other words, assist our truckers, mainly our cross-Canada truckers, so that they and any of the other provinces would have the same set of rules in each of the provinces across the nation, and that it would also work in the sense of permits that were provided by the United States to Alberta truckers, because that has already occurred, and we have many of them in place, and my information, Mr. Speaker, is that the Alberta trucking industry will take on any of those particular truckers at any time with this deregulation that's been in the process for the last 4 to 5 years.
But, Mr. Speaker, our trucking industry is suffering because of the Minister's decision to rush to deregulate the licensing part. Is the Minister prepared now to abandon or at least slow down the deregulation of licensing in view of the chaos that has resulted in its implementation?
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the honourable member would be prepared to provide me with some information that identifies the chaos that he speaks of, or any of the other information that he has about truckers that are in fact in difficulty. Because my information as recently as last week from the industry itself was that Alberta has consistently been the leader, and they are very, very pleased with that, in the sense that we have been working toward the deregulation for the period between 1985 and now, and that in fact what we have done is show that Alberta consistently is the leader in putting in place the kind of regulations that we have. Alberta is the least regulated of any province in the nation.
But unfortunately, there's unfair competition existing in the way that other provinces are treating our truckers. Can the minister then indicate what action he will take if other provinces continue dragging their feet on the question of licensing deregulation?
Mr. Speaker, about 2 months ago, it might even be 3 months ago, I wrote to the federal minister indicating that there was a concern starting to arise in Ontario over a case that was in Ontario, and they had ceased to issue any licenses, not only to Ontario truckers, but to any other Canadian truckers, and would he ensure that we were consistent in the move right across the nation. That has already taken place, and to my knowledge, they are starting to fit into the program. The next phase, Mr. Speaker, for implementation is January 1 of '89.
Unfortunately, we should be all going in step, but can the minister confirm that in the United States, deregulation has merely aided large trucking corporations by eliminating many thousands of small trucking companies by driving down rates briefly and then raising them after competition has been eliminated? Will the same thing happen here in Canada?
I can't confirm that. If you have any information that you could provide me, I'd be happy to check it out, because my understanding is, and I say it again, Alberta truckers hold no fear of U.S. trucking dominance over regulatory reform and are prepared to compete with the U.S. truckers at any level with our deregulation that's in place now.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplemental, Mr. Speaker, to the minister. Has the minister made any study as to if this is hypothetical, Mr. Speaker, but probably not. No, okay.
By the members on admission. I'll do it quickly.
One, and this hurts me to say it, the Free Trade Pact is implemented, whether or not the different licensing between provinces can still continue?
My understanding, Mr. Speaker, is that the deregulation of this industry, as has occurred in the United States a number of years ago, will not impact on the free trade, other than the fact that it'll open the borders for movement of goods both to the U.S. and from the U.S.
Thank you. Calgary Buffalo, followed by Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is to the Minister of Energy. The government's recent propaganda on free trade questions and answers asks some good questions, but unfortunately, many answers are misleading and even wrong. For example, the booklet asks whether Canada has made a commitment to share our energy supplies, and then says, and I quote, that the commitment for access to other commodities and for crude oil is no different than Canada's existing commitment under the GATT and the International Energy Agency. Well, the reality is that under the free trade agreement, we are prevented from cutting our exports to the United States below the proportion of energy over the previous 36 months, and this is a restriction far beyond GATT and the International Energy Agency. Now, the minister's a math teacher, so let's see what this means in natural gas terms, where we now export about 30% of production to the U.S. and going up. Will the minister admit that if we want to cut back a net 3% of the 30% going to the United States, which is 10% of exports to the U.S., that we would have to commensurately cut back 10% in production in Canada in order to keep the proportions in order?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I won't treat this as an arithmetic class, but emphasize to the honourable member that there have been conditions in place for many years through the International Energy Agency with respect to sharing of supplies in emergency-type situations. And, of course, through GATT as well, there are conditions. And yes, the free trade agreement does relate to the sharing of energy supplies. However, there are conditions that are in place which will certainly look after Canadian needs. In fact, we've been emphasizing all along, Mr. Speaker, that the best protection that any consumer can have, either in this country or in the United States, is through long-term contracts. And these contracts are being made between buyers and sellers today, and we expect that they will continue and increase, particularly in central Canada, where we've been trying to get the message across that the most secure supply is through long-term contracts.
Well, the fact is that a 3% cut in the U.S. would require a 10% cut in Canada, and there's no way that we can realistically cut back production in Canada. And I'm wondering whether the minister will then admit that under the free trade formula we've locked ourselves into a structure where we can't cut back on the U.S. exports because it would be like a boomerang that would hit us harder. Or does he think it's realistic to cut back on Canadian production and sales by 10%?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member certainly has got a different interpretation than what we have to the free trade agreement, and we would, as I say, I'm certainly not going to respond to his arithmetic in here today.
Well, why don't you tell us what it is instead of giving us a bunch of baloney?
That's the question. Is that the question? Is that the question, honourable member?
Getting to that, Mr. Speaker. The important question that I would ask the minister is what kind of a deal this province has with other provinces or with the federal government to share any internal cutbacks in Canada under free trade under the International Energy Agency agreement. Does Alberta share in these cutbacks, or does it leave the rest of Canada to take the whole burden?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the free trade agreement would have just the opposite impact on the development of our reserves in this country from what the honourable member is insinuating. We see the free trade agreement as an opportunity to have an assured market for our future supplies of oil and gas, and the energy industry in this country is very, very pleased with that agreement. And in addition, in terms of investment in Canada, the free trade agreement is expected to provide an opportunity for a significant investment from the United States into our development of our long-term reserves. So, Mr. Speaker, the free trade agreement is seen as a very much of a positive from the perspective of energy development in this province. Further aspects relate to the petrochemical industry, where we have the removal of tariffs, and which will have a significant contribution to the future development of energy in this province.
Mr. Speaker, the minister hasn't even attempted to answer my questions. All we're getting is roses and no problems. And I'm wondering, with the government pressing for long-term contracts with purchasers in the United States and elsewhere, what kind of planning process does the minister have in motion to ensure that we don't get snookered into a situation such as I described, where we can't, in fact, cut back on exports in the future because we hurt ourselves worse?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is trying to create a situation of fright for the industry. The free trade agreement, as I indicated, actually would be incentive for the future development of supplies in this country. So we're not in the least concerned about the fact that we would be short of supplies in the future. We have over half the world's reserves of heavy oil and oil sands in this province to be developed in the future, and this would provide an opportunity for us to develop those reserves.
Calgary Forest Lawn.
Speaker, going back to the original questions about the sale of natural gas into U.S. markets, how does the minister intend to ensure that the interests of Albertans are safeguarded if we enter into long-term contracts in the United States against interventions by American regulatory agencies?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the owners of the resource in this province, we have control over the development of our reserves in this province. And when we enter into contracts, our producers enter into contracts, long-term contracts for those future supplies, we intend to uphold those contracts and be a good supplier for our customers in the future. So the ownership, as owners of the resources, we will certainly be able to make sure that Albertans are well served with respect to their future energy needs, and that long-term contracts will protect those who want to enter into them.
Thank you. Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Constitution and Charter recognizes Aboriginal rights, but does not define what those are. 4 First Ministers' conferences on Aboriginal rights have ended in failure. Though the Meech Lake Accord committed the premiers to yearly meetings, the defining of Aboriginal rights was not put on the agenda for those meetings. I'd like to ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, why was it that the issue of Aboriginal rights was not put on the agenda for future First Ministers' conferences as part of the Meech Lake Accord?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is incorrect. The meetings did not end in failure. The meetings were the result of a great deal of input, both by Native groups and by governments, and each meeting moved both groups towards a better understanding of the problems that are faced in the matter of Aboriginal rights and set the stage for future meetings. The Prime Minister chairs the First Ministers' meetings, and as chairman, he felt that the next meeting on Aboriginal rights should come after the result of more work that would see a greater amount of progress that could also be made at the next meeting, and therefore we'll call them at the request of the chair. The government of Alberta, as most members know, supported strongly by this legislature, wanted to have as the #1 constitutional item the reform of the Senate. We fought for that and we have it.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we still don't have a resolution of this issue, regardless of what the Premier says about the intent or the desire to have it resolved. So I'd like to ask the Premier if he's had discussions with other First Ministers in order to set up a timetable and a work plan to put Aboriginal rights back on the national agenda for future First Ministers' conferences to define those rights in the Constitution.
Mr. Speaker, from time to time at First Ministers' meetings, at the Western Premiers' Conference, and I'm sure at the Premiers' Conference this summer in Saskatoon, these matters are discussed and will be again. As pointed out by the Honourable Solicitor General today, Alberta took the position that the responsibility for Métis people for Aboriginal and self-government were ones that we were concentrating on for the time being, and we have in fact, as the Solicitor General pointed out today, made a major move in that direction.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, is he telling the legislature this afternoon that we will have to get a change in the Canadian Senate, that we will have to reform the Canadian Senate before we can look at any other issue on changing the Canadian Constitution, particularly Aboriginal rights?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member can review Hansard, and he would find that that is absolutely not what I was saying. I said that on the matter of Meech Lake, the government of Alberta was fighting for a commitment to reform of the Senate. That's strongly endorsed by this legislature, overwhelmingly endorsed by Albertans. We're fighting to get that reform of the Senate accomplished. And the preferred reform, which is also strongly endorsed by this legislature and the people of Alberta, is the Triple E Senate. So we're going to be fighting for that. The Prime Minister may well call an Aboriginal rights in native self-government meeting at any time.
I'd like to ask the Premier, will he give his personal commitment today in the legislature that he will approach the Prime Minister and request that the Prime Minister call such a meeting in order to resolve the matter of Aboriginal rights in the Canadian Constitution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, no, I won't do that. I will certainly cooperate in every way possible in the next First Minister's meeting, either on native self-government or on Aboriginal rights. But I will not, because the honourable member feels that it's something that he would want to do, I will not make the commitment to try and force a meeting prior to the right time and conditions under which that meeting should be held.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, possibly to the Solicitor General on Aboriginal rights. Could the Solicitor General enlighten the House as to just where he or where this government sees the non-status Indian fitting in this constitutional argument for self-government with the federal government or with the Métis Settlement Act?
Mr. Speaker, that jurisdiction is actually under the Fica Minister, who's absent, but the Constitution spells out that Indians are a federal responsibility. I will agree with him that there is some debate as to those who are off reserve at present. That does not mean those cannot return to the reserve, and at this stage the province has taken willingly the jurisdiction of the Métis, and I believe the others are still in the federal jurisdiction.
Thank you. Edmonton Belmont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are directed to the Minister of Education. They're about community schools, which are an important component in our educational system. Indeed, the community school program has received worldwide recognition. I'm advised that the Department of Education has evaluated all 66 community schools, and I'm wondering if the Minister of Education could advise us of that, of those on-site evaluations.
If the member is asking for some specific information with respect to specific schools, perhaps he could be, in fact, more specific. I don't have at my fingertips at this point what the results of evaluations would be on community schools and many other schools that we evaluate across the province.
Well, let's try this specific then. How many of the schools that were evaluated were awarded the continuing designation based on the merit of the evaluation?
I don't know, Mr. Speaker. The question would have to go on to the order paper, and I'd be pleased to provide the information for the honourable member.
I'm wondering then, Mr. Speaker, if the Department of Education has in fact done an overview of the complete set of evaluations, all 66 as opposed to just the 15 that were contained in the Harvey report. Department? You don't have an overview from the department? Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we hear on a regular basis that the community school program is an important component and that this government is fully supportive of the program. And given that, I'm wondering then, when is this government going to restore full funding to the community school program? Full funding.
Well, Mr. Speaker, question's been asked before, number one, but we finally get to the bottom line. The purpose of all schools in this province is to provide the best possible education for all students within those schools within this province. The community school education is an important part of our education system, but not as important as the overall context of providing education opportunity for all students in Alberta. With respect to how those extraordinary dollars which flow to community schools are going to be apportioned to those schools, I have told the honourable member on at least 4 occasions in this present session that we are looking at ways in which those funds could better be spent to improve educational opportunity. I am still continuing to do that and believe that we can come up with perhaps some better solutions than perhaps exist right now.
Thank you. Cypress Redcliffe.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. I wonder if the Minister, when she is reviewing that, can also review what can be done for all those schools that are doing community school work in the community without the additional funding.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's really the issue, isn't it? There is nothing to prevent schools from using their facilities, as many schools do in this province, beyond the actual hours of school operation. One doesn't need an extraordinary amount of funding from the province under the community school program in order to do that. Nonetheless, I think there are some excellent programs which are occurring in our community schools, and those are being funded to an extraordinary way by about an extra $37,000 per community school across the province. If there is a better way, and I am working with the Community Education Association to see if we can perhaps bring along some of those schools which are operating as full-fledged community schools without an extra cent from the province, that may be one of the opportunities that we have here for more creative use of limited government dollars.
Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This valuable program helps schools in areas with special problems, and this means low-income areas which are so badly neglected by this government. I'm wondering whether it wouldn't make sense to focus on funneling additional resources to those community schools in areas where there are demographic problems, such as inner-city schools or schools with large immigrant populations and many single-parent families. Why don't we do that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will stand by, and I know this government will stand by, the record of opportunity that we give for all Albertans in this province. It's not something that's based, we do believe in universal access to education. We have a bill before this legislature which reflects that for the first time in this province's history. We have a motion on the order paper with respect to a social policy, which, although it will die on the order paper, will, I know, be reintroduced by this government as we debate the very important issue of who needs assistance and how we can extend universality as far as possible. With respect to the community school program, I think, in fact, there are some ways in which we might be able to better utilize those funds. And this is really a matter of budgetary interest, and one that could well be raised next year when we reassess the education budget before the legislature.
Edmonton Highlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, I suppose, carry on a series of questions I initiated last Thursday with the Minister of Career Development and Employment, who answered in a very specious way to my question about how many people get hired on permanently after they've been on a wage subsidy program, and I quote, "An outside study that we had done for the department indicated that close to 60% of the individuals who are hired under the program are retained," and he didn't say either, but I should say either retained after the program has expired or find other jobs or go back for further education. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's not precisely a quote. I want to ask the minister this. The minister wouldn't answer the real question. Will he answer it now? How many people who were hired under a wage subsidy program are actually kept on by that employer after the wage subsidy expires?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the intent of the wage subsidy program is not necessarily to create a permanent job after the work experience is conducted. Just as important, Mr. Speaker, is for individuals who get that work experience, if they see the opportunity that they need greater skill upgrading or want to enhance their education, that they proceed on to furthering their education at one of our post-secondary institutions, or pursue an opportunity under one of our training programs. And in addition, as I indicated the other day, Mr. Speaker, if the individuals end up, as a result of that work experience, getting a job somewhere else, I see that just as important as the retention after the program expires.
And he's still avoiding the issue, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the minister a supplementary then. What's he telling Albertans, Mr. Speaker, that up to $100,000 a year per employer in wage subsidy is not meant to create jobs? Is that what he's saying?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know. Maybe somebody else can answer that question, because I certainly don't understand it. But let me say that program is a very useful program to the extent that it gives individuals who are unemployed an opportunity to get on-the-job work experience. That program, Mr. Speaker, is for the employee. The employer is the facilitator for the job experience that is being had by the employee. To suggest that it's a subsidy for the employer is not even half of the equation, Mr. Speaker. The important fact is that individuals are getting valuable on-the-job work experience. Any study that the honourable member would like to review will indicate that a lack of recent work experience is the biggest barrier to finding a job, Mr. Speaker.
For the Premier's dinner.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the minister, who obviously doesn't like the questions. He said last Thursday that he doesn't have an agency or body intact to monitor whether or not these employers who are getting all that rich subsidy formula are ripping the system off. Is he prepared to do that in light of the fact that many of them use those programs as a turnstile simply for subsidized labor and nothing else?
Am I prepared to do what, Mr. Speaker?
Subsidized labor.
Subsidized labor.
I'm not sure what she's asking me to do, Mr. Speaker. I guess that's a problem. Maybe she could clarify the position.
May I repeat the question, Mr. Speaker? Thank you. Is the minister prepared now to put in place a monitoring agency to determine if the employers are simply ripping off the system so that they can get subsidized wages?
Mr. Speaker, we do a monitoring of the wage subsidy program, and that program has facilitated on-the-job work experience for thousands of Albertans. Now, I cannot undertake to this member or to anyone that we can monitor every particular contract that we enter into. I can undertake to the honourable member, and we do on a regular basis, do a random check and a random search in the computer of our programs, and we do follow up with them, Mr. Speaker. Now, that wage subsidy program has been a very useful program, and I should indicate to the honourable member that it has a program that served Albertans well, particularly Albertans well, during periods of high unemployment. And to suggest that it has done otherwise, Mr. Speaker, I have thousands of testimonials that I get as a result of the success of that program.
Final supplement.
No, Edmonton Goldbar. I'm sorry, honourable member. Edmonton Goldbar. Thank you. Edmonton Goldbar, thank you.
Mr. Speaker, to the minister, this is shocking information. You know, we're spending millions and we really haven't any mechanism to test. Mr. Speaker, I suggest there's been plenty of time for tracking. If this is not creating jobs, if it is not creating permanent jobs, then what's it doing? Are the people going into retraining, or are they in fact going back on social assistance or UIC? Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, it would be much easier to respond if the honourable member would listen to the questions and the answers previously given. Firstly, we do monitor. To suggest that we don't monitor the program, the honourable member did not hear the answer to the question. The second point that she made is that these jobs aren't creating full-time jobs. I answered that, in fact, they are creating full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. How do we expect to answer her question if she doesn't listen? It's not even a supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Time for question period has expired. Might we revert, orders of the day. Might we revert briefly to the introduction?